The blizzard descended on the Rockies, a wall of white sealing the mountains and the silence inside Duke's cabin. 4 months he'd spent hiding from the ghosts of war and the memory of his lost brother Leo. But the storm brought a messenger, a starving German shepherd, its coat dusted with snow and secrets. Clamped in its jaws was not a bone, but a broken camera card, and around its neck, a collar unlike any other. Thick, cold leather hiding a faint electronic pulse. This dog wasn't seeking shelter, it was tracking. It was a wire, a pawn sent to lead a grieving soldier straight into the crosshairs of the powerful men who knew what Leo had found. The trap was set, and the snow was already covering their tracks. The historical blizzard did not arrive in Colorado as a gentle dusting. It came as an invasion, a relentless whiteout that descended upon the high Rocky Mountain peaks, with crushing force burying the landscape under feet of snow and driving the wind to a shriek that sounded less like nature and more like 1,000 tormented souls trapped in the high-altitude air. This was the kind of storm that swallowed light and sound, enforcing a profound, absolute isolation on the few souls brave or foolish enough to live in the timberline cabins above Boulder. On the porch of a weathered single-room structure made of dark cedar logs, a heavy accumulation of snow already pressed against the door, threatening to breach the thin barrier between safety and certain freezing death. Inside, the noise was almost as oppressive as the cold. Duke sat on a stool next to a roaring wood stove, listening to the wind hammer the sheet metal chimney cap. At 35, Duke was a man forged in places far hotter and drier than the Colorado mountains, a former Army Ranger whose lean, powerful frame spoke of years spent carrying weight and moving fast. His brown hair was grown long enough to tuck beneath a faded beanie, and his face, usually hidden behind a dense, dark beard, was currently scraped clean, revealing sharp angles and eyes that were the color of glacial ice. Eyes that saw everything but often chose to look at nothing. He wore thick wool socks, insulated overalls over a thermal shirt, and moved with a restless, coiled tension, as if always waiting for the order to move out. 4 months he had been here, cutting himself off from the world. The radio silenced, the truck parked, the road long since impassable. He had been running from the guilt, running from the memory of his brother Leo, a conservation photographer who had vanished without a trace up one of these unforgiving peaks. Leo's gear had been found, damaged, and the official report was simple, brutal, presumed lost in a climbing accident. Duke knew better than to trust simple answers, but he had been too hollowed out by his own ghosts to search for complex ones. He closed his eyes, the high-pitched whistle of the wind shifting in his auditory cortex, transforming into the whine of an inbound mortar round, the sound he hadn't heard since the sand-blasted deserts of Afghanistan a decade ago. It was a frequent visitor now, that noise, a sonic symptom of the PTSD that held him hostage. He flinched, his hand instinctively gripping the heavy, flat-bladed knife he kept strapped to the inside of his boot. The same knife he had learned to clean with a meticulous, focusing precision that gave him an anchor in the chaos of his own mind. He forced a long, shaky breath out, the vapor immediately condensing in the cold air of the cabin's periphery. Just the wind, Ranger. Just the goddamn wind. He stood up, his joints popping slightly in the dry cold, a sound that, thankfully, remained just a sound. He walked to the woodpile, noting with a military man's precision that his inventory was low. He would need to make a dangerous short trip outside if the storm didn't break soon, a risk analysis he ran automatically in his head. The parallel necessity of survival and his specialized training was the only thing that had kept him functioning. He had turned the cabin into a self-contained fortress. Military survival techniques dictated the careful rationing of his dehydrated meals. the precise stacking of fire bricks around the stove for maximum radiant heat dispersal, and the systematic reinforcement of the door frame against the wind's assault. He was pouring a ladle of hot water from the kettle into a mug of instant coffee, a small, comforting routine, when he heard the noise. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't his head. It was a sound that cut through the deep bass of the storm, a sound alien and sharp, a desperate scratching sound against the outside of the door, immediately followed by a weak, strained whimper. Duke froze, his body going instantly rigid, the ranger training seizing control. Contact. He moved silently across the cabin floor, not bothering with his boots, his wool socks providing silent traction. He grabbed the small tactical flashlight from the shelf and approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs in a nervous rhythm that felt entirely unwarranted for a man who had faced down RPGs. A stray animal in a blizzard this severe was highly unusual. He pressed his ear against the cold wood. The scratching was still there, now coupled with a frantic, shallow panting. He didn't unbar the door. Instead, he knelt, pulled aside the rug, and peered through the small, iced-over peephole he had drilled years ago. The wind was a solid white wall, but against the dark cedar of the porch railing, he saw movement. He pulled the thick oak bar off the door and yanked it open just enough to see what was there, flooding the porch with a rectangle of yellow light and a rush of freezing air. Huddled against the door frame, nearly buried by a fresh drift, was a dog. It was an unmistakable German shepherd, or a Malinois mix by the look of its tall, keen ears, but one that was terrifyingly small and weak. This was his first appearance, and his state was shocking. Charlie, as Duke would soon know him, was little more than a silver-gray skeleton wrapped in wet, matted fur. His coat, a rare blend of silver and charcoal, was plastered flat against a frame where every rib was visible, and his large, intelligent amber eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, squinting against the unexpected light. He was trembling violently, his left hind leg held slightly off the snow, clearly injured. Charlie was not a magnificent working dog yet, barely more than a puppy, maybe 6 to 8 months old, but there was a deep current of endurance and wariness in his posture, a resilience that defied his pitiful condition. As the door opened, the dog didn't lunge for shelter or food. He simply collapsed further into the snow, letting out a soft, final groan of defeat. But the dog was holding something. Clenched in Charlie's jaw, held with a gentle, determined grip, was not a piece of charred flannel or a stick, but a small black plastic rectangle. It was a broken memory card for a camera, and trailing from the dog's mouth, stuck to the card, was a short, jagged piece of thick, woven fabric that had been torn away from a larger object. The fabric was bright, almost neon orange. Duke stared at the color that should not exist in the muted palette of the winter mountains. His breath hitched in his throat. He knew that specific shade. It was the distinguishing high-visibility color Leo had used for his custom camera straps, his personal signature, meant to make his gear identifiable in the dense forest or on the rocky slopes. Leo, the one who was supposed to be dead. Duke dropped the flashlight onto the porch snow and lunged, not caring about the sudden rush of frigid wind that hit his exposed chest. "Leo!" he rasped, his voice cracked with disuse and shock. He gently touched the dog, who flinched but did not let go of the object. "Easy, easy, good boy." Duke knelt, his knees sinking into the snow, and peeled the frozen memory card and the neon orange strap fragment from Charlie's desperate grip. The dog immediately rested his chin on Duke's thigh, surrendering completely to the warmth and contact. Ignoring the bitter cold that was already seeping into his overalls, Duke scooped the impossibly light animal up, carrying him inside the relative warmth of the cabin. He deposited the dog onto a pile of old blankets near the stove. The dog, Charlie, immediately curled into a tight, shivering ball, exhausted. Duke moved with frantic military efficiency, forcing his emotions and the internal shriek of the phantom mortar round back down. Handle the immediate threat. The parallel detail of his training took over. He grabbed his specialized army field dressing kit and a towel. His hands, though rough, were surprisingly gentle as he toweled the moisture from the dog's coat and used his skills to quickly assess the injury. The limp was due to a severely sprained ankle, not a break. He used an emergency compression bandage to secure the leg. Then came the food. He opened a can of his own highly rationed, protein-rich emergency beef stew, quickly rinsing the sauce off the meat before placing the chunks on a plate for the starving dog. Charlie devoured the food with a desperate intensity that made Duke wince. As Charlie ate, Duke's attention was drawn to the dog's neck. Around it was a collar. It was thick, at least 2 inches wide, made of dark, heavy-duty leather lined with black neoprene. Far too robust and expensive for a simple family dog or even a local working dog. Henry, his brother, had been frugal. Duke ran his fingers along the leather. There was no seam, no buckle, no metal tongue. The leather formed a continuous, seamless loop. His ranger mind immediately categorized it. Non-standard issue. Security application. He walked to his small workbench, picked up his tactical multi-tool, and returned to Charlie, who was now resting but watchful. Duke gently lifted the dog's head. Embedded in the leather was a small, oblong metal plate, not unlike the housing for a chip. It had 2 tiny, perfectly drilled ports. He pressed down on the metal, testing it. It was cold, dense, and unyielding. This wasn't a collar you bought at a farm supply store. This was a piece of purpose-built equipment. The realization landed on Duke like a cold weight of dread, immediately superseding the phantom sound of the mortar fire. This is why the dog came to me. This is why he wasn't running. Someone hadn't just lost Charlie, someone had controlled him. Leo's distinctive neon orange strap, the fractured memory card, and now this inescapable, expensive professional tracking device. The pieces snapped together with a terrible clarity that was sharper than any mountain air. This dog was not a rescue. Charlie was not a stray. He was a carefully delivered package, a controlled messenger sent straight to the only person who would recognize the clues. They hadn't tried to find the evidence themselves. They had used the dog to lead Duke to them, confirming his deepest fear. Leo's death was not an accident. The ghosts of war might have been loud, but the silence of this new present danger was deafening. Duke leaned back against the wall, the warmth of the stove a stark contrast to the cold fury starting to settle in his gut. The fury of the storm had finally receded, not with a gentle fade, but with the sudden, exhausted silence of a defeated army. The world outside Duke's cabin was a masterpiece of white, pristine and vast, but the air remained bone-aching cold, a deep, pervasive cold unique to the high Colorado Rockies in late November. The sun, finally breaking through the heavy cloud cover, was a cruel, brilliant enemy, glinting off the newly formed ice crystals and emphasizing the profound isolation. Inside, the quiet was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the rhythmic sound of a dog lapping water. Duke, dressed in his thermal shirt and insulated overalls, sat by his workbench, the thick, black leather collar and the tiny, cracked memory card lying under the focused beam of his old, military-grade headlamp. He hadn't slept, instead spending the night monitoring Charlie, the silver-gray German shepherd puppy, who was now resting quietly, his injured leg supported by Duke's makeshift bandage. Duke had managed to extract the single, corrupted file from the memory card, but his attempts to run any standard decryption protocol against it failed. It was locked down, encrypted with a complexity that hinted at specialized knowledge. far beyond the casual efforts of a conservation photographer like his brother Leo. Duke carefully turned the black collar over, holding it up to the light. The faint electronic pulse he'd detected the night before was indeed a low-frequency signal, likely broadcast to keep the tracker alive while the main GPS signal was dormant. This wasn't off-the-shelf surveillance. This was tailored professional-grade equipment. The realization solidified the truth. Leo hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered by men organized enough to weaponize a dog. Duke knew he needed help, but not from the local sheriff's office, who would label this a paranoid delusion from a shell-shocked veteran. He needed an ally who knew the mountains and, more importantly, already held doubts about Leo's official story. He walked over to his satellite phone, the kind of expensive, rugged device Leo had insisted they both carry, and punched in a familiar number. A crisp, professional voice answered almost immediately. Forest Service Ranger Station. Sadie speaking. The name was a lifeline. Sadie was the local park ranger, a woman he knew primarily through her persistent, formal check-ins following Leo's disappearance. She was a woman in her late 30s or early 40s with striking auburn hair, usually pulled back tight beneath the wide brim of her Forest Service uniform hat. Today, her voice carried the exhausted sharpness of someone who had just survived the same historic storm. Her standard attire was the practical, no-nonsense uniform. A dark forest green jacket over a utility shirt, rugged brown trousers tucked into heavy hiking boots. Sadie was known in the valley for her pragmatism and her unwavering dedication to the protected lands, a dedication that often put her at odds with commercial interests. "Sadie, it's Duke Clay. I need you to come up." There was a beat of stunned silence on the line. "Duke, are you all right? The road's impassable and the power grid is down county-wide. I know. This isn't about me, it's about Leo. And I have proof his accident wasn't an accident. I have a dog, a memory card, and I need you to bring a satellite laptop uplink. Meet me at the Blackwood Trailhead, the old logging path on snowshoes. I'll meet you halfway." He cut the connection before she could argue, a classic ranger move designed to enforce immediate compliance. An hour later, Duke, wrapped in his outer shell jacket and snowshoes, met Sadie at the designated spot. The silence between the two was initially thick, weighed down by 4 months of unspoken grief and Duke's withdrawal. Sadie's eyes, usually sharp and focused on the safety of the land, were now fixed on Duke with a mix of concern and professional skepticism. She carried a backpack that looked far too heavy and a small satellite case. Duke wasted no time on pleasantries. He led her off the main trail to a small, secluded rock overhang. Charlie, despite his sprained leg, followed Duke's lead without a leash, his silver-gray head held low, moving with an eerie, quiet purpose. When they stopped, Charlie instinctively positioned himself slightly behind Duke, facing the direction of the main trail, a posture that immediately caught Sadie's professional eye. Duke knelt and pulled the black leather collar from his bag. "This is Charlie. He showed up in the storm, carrying this," Duke said, holding up the cracked memory card. He explained in concise, precise language, devoid of any emotional hyperbole, how he identified the low-frequency broadcast. He then detailed his failed decryption attempt on the memory card. "He's not a stray, Sadie. He's a tactical asset. He was released to find the only person who would recognize Leo's orange strap. Me." Sadie, the professional skeptic, slowly knelt beside him. Her personality, marked by practicality, compelled her to inspect the evidence. She ran a gloved finger over the seamless closure of Charlie's collar, her brow furrowing. "This isn't standard issue, you're right. It's too clean, too hardened. If it's emitting, it's not passive." She took the memory card. One file, encrypted, no headers. That is thorough. Leo was meticulous. If he went through this much trouble to hide one file, it contains everything. She paused, looking at Duke, her skepticism softening into genuine concern. Duke, I've been trying to find a reason to reopen Leo's case for months. I knew he wouldn't go up that peak without telling me his route, but the official report was airtight. Ice fall, equipment failure. She ran a hand across the rough, green fabric of her jacket. This was her chance, the validation of her intuition. Tell me what Leo was working on, Duke demanded, his voice low and intense. He wouldn't be this careful unless he found something big. Sadie sighed, leaning back against the cold rock face, the breath condensing in the frigid air. She revealed a secondary parallel plot thread that had been running beneath Duke's radar. He was focused on the headwaters of the Blue River, our main reserve watershed. There's a mining exploration company, Apex Extraction, that bought the old Black Mesa tract just over the ridge. They've been conducting seismic surveys and exploratory drilling. The CEO is a man named Randall Hayes. Hayes is a man in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed in custom, expensive outerwear, an arrogant executive who treats the mountains like his personal checking account. He's been fighting the Forest Service for months over easement rights. Leo started sending me flagged water quality reports 4 months ago. High levels of chemical runoff near their boundary. Nothing conclusive enough for a warrant, but enough to worry me. Leo went silent right after he promised me the visual proof of their discharge point. They claimed he was trespassing. He was going to expose them for polluting the reserve's water to cut costs. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place in Duke's mind, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The murder wasn't about a debt or a personal vendetta. It was about resource protection and corporate greed. Leo had become a threat to a massive mining operation led by Mr. Hayes. The fire that was supposed to destroy all evidence had only failed because of Charlie. They killed him for a water sample, Duke muttered, the anger hardening his jaw. And they sent his dog to me to find what he hid. Sadie nodded, her expression grim. The question is, where is the full data set? Duke returned to the memory card, his mind now clear, focused by the certainty of the enemy. His military training hadn't just taught him to fight, it had taught him to analyze intelligence, to look for hidden messages and anomalies. The encrypted file was his objective. He had tried brute force decryption, now he tried lateral thinking. Leo knew I would find this. He would leave a back door. Duke began running a script that pulled the file's metadata, searching for any non-random or repetitive patterns. He focused on the file's size and the precise timestamps, comparing them to Leo's known field coordinates. Nothing. Frustrated, Duke leaned his head back, his eyes momentarily meeting Sadie's. Leo always used environmental poetry for his encryption keys, something beautiful and utterly untraceable. Sadie shook her head. Not this time, Duke. This looks like a proprietary key. Maybe hardware linked. Duke closed his eyes, accessing the one part of his memory that hadn't been fractured by PTSD. His brother's voice, his sense of humor, his obsession with the Western landscape. Leo had an almost childish reverence for a famous local landmark. Duke typed the command to open the file using a new method, scanning the entire encrypted block for a specific common phrase. He used a quote Leo often cited, related to light and ancient stone. The screen flickered violently, then settled. A small secondary text window popped up, appearing not as part of the data, but hidden within the file's structure itself, placed there by Leo as a final testament. The message was concise, a geolocated instruction that sounded like a warning. Duke read it aloud, his voice gaining a hard, focused edge. The cache is where the sun hits the red rock. The air felt suddenly charged, the single line of text cutting through the chilling silence of the mountain. "Red Rock Canyon," Sadie breathed, her eyes widening. "It's 100 miles west of here, right on the edge of the wilderness boundary, famous for the afternoon sun exposure." Duke nodded, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "It's a landmark, easy to find, impossible to hide." Leo used a physical location as the key. He was about to ask Sadie to check the exact coordinates of the landmark when a sound cut him off. A low, resonant whimper from Charlie. The dog, who had been resting quietly, was now sitting upright, his silver-gray coat bristling. Charlie's ears were not pointed at the surrounding woods, but inward, toward Duke, and his tail gave a single, anxious thump against the snow. Duke looked at him. Charlie had been quiet throughout the conversation, but when Duke had mentioned Mr. Hayes and Apex Extraction earlier, Charlie had shifted. The whimper now was directed at Duke, a plea or an instruction. Duke stood up. "What is it, boy?" Charlie stood too, ignoring the pain in his leg, and began to limp not toward the cabin, but toward the side of the small rock overhang they were sheltering beneath. He pressed his nose against the frozen rock wall, then turned and looked at Duke, letting out a single, insistent bark. Duke followed Charlie, pushing aside the thick accumulation of snow and the frozen ivy that clung to the stone. He felt the cold, hard stone give way slightly beneath his fingertips. This was a new, unexpected detail. He recognized the subtle texture change in the stone. Leo, always the preparer, had covered an old vertical utility hatch with thin stone veneer. Duke knelt, pulling back the veneer. Hidden behind it was a small, heavy wooden trapdoor, reinforced with steel strapping. This was the entry to the cabin's original deep-root cellar, a feature Duke never used, but one Leo, with his practical nature, would have seen as a perfect, naturally insulated storage area. Charlie whined again, now directing his attention specifically to a smaller wooden box, resting on the dirt floor inside the cold, earthy-smelling cellar. Duke reached in and pulled it out. It was a metal, reinforced storage container, the kind designed to withstand pressure changes and high impact. Leo hadn't just relied on the memory card. The cache wasn't just in the Red Rock Canyon. The last part of the truth was here. This was the secret compartment in the storage cellar where Leo often stashed his shock-proof equipment. The low-frequency pulse from Charlie's collar seemed to intensify for a second, a silent confirmation of mission complete. Duke looked at the box, then at the dog. The truth was not just in the future. It was buried right beneath their feet. The journey from the cabin, though shorter than the storm-tossed miles Duke had run in his dreams, was a grueling exercise in tension. They had managed to retrieve Duke's heavy-duty truck from a cleared logging path, though every mile on the icy, twisting mountain road felt like a deliberate parade into enemy territory. The day was starkly different from the blinding white of the blizzard's aftermath. They had descended into the famous Red Rock Canyon region, a landscape defined by towering monoliths of deep crimson sandstone that glowed with a fierce, almost violent intensity under the bright, cold November sun. The air was thin and frigid, carrying the scent of pine and ancient stone, but the visual contrast was jarring, the blazing red rock against the blinding white snow. This open vastness offered no cover, making Duke feel utterly exposed. He knew that the moment they had driven out of the narrow valley, the GPS tracker embedded in Charlie's thick, black leather collar had locked onto them. They were a bright red target on Mr. Hayes's surveillance screen. Sadie, dressed in her standard dark Forest Service jacket and wide-brimmed hat, drove with a focused intensity, her hands gripping the wheel. She was no longer questioning Duke. The evidence they had found in the root cellar Leo's preliminary notes and a specialized geological drill bit had cemented her belief. Charlie, the silver-gray German Shepherd puppy, now treated with a brace on his sprained ankle, sat in the back of the truck, his large amber eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, his body tense. He was still a creature of fear, but his primal, loyal instinct was now firmly aligned with Duke. They located the precise canyon where the light hit the rock face at the optimum angle, validating Leo's cryptic clue. Duke pulled the truck into the relative seclusion of a small, disused quarry access road. The area was riddled with the skeletal remains of decades of failed mining operations, providing a labyrinth of rusted equipment and abandoned shafts. It was a perfect place to hide or to be trapped. Duke immediately addressed the tracking problem. "We can't go in with this hot," he murmured, nodding toward Charlie's collar. "They'll be waiting at the cache point." Sadie, the pragmatic ranger, pulled out a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. "Let's just cut it off. We're deep enough now." Duke shook his head, his face grim. "No, that's what a civilian would do. If the signal dies, they know we know. They'll accelerate their response. We need to create an electromagnetic shadow, make the signal look like it's still moving, but keep the data frozen." This was the kind of tactical thinking forged in war zones where deception was as crucial as firepower. Duke quickly began assembling the tools he'd planned for. An old, powerful magnet scavenged from the back of the root cellar, a length of wire pulled from the truck's spare power cable, and a small damaged battery pack from Sadie's satellite kit. He had Sadie lead Charlie into a small, dry cave entrance hidden behind a stand of juniper trees, a natural Faraday cage formed by the conductive minerals in the rock. "Keep him calm," Duke instructed. He then carefully wrapped the wire around the collar and connected it to the magnet and the battery pack. The intent was not to destroy the circuits, but to saturate the tracker's receiving antenna with noise. A localized electromagnetic pulse, EMP, strong enough to overwhelm the GPS signal while leaving the low-frequency pulse intact, tricking the enemy's receiver into thinking the collar was either glitching or moving randomly within the deep canyon system. The small battery pack hummed, and Duke saw the tiny metal plate on the collar flicker almost imperceptibly. "Shadow deployed," he said, tucking the simple device beneath a heavy rock near the cave entrance. "Now we move fast," leaving Charlie securely hidden and relatively safe. Duke and Sadie, moving with the practiced stealth of soldiers on patrol, began the climb toward the designated Red Rock Spire. They navigated the treacherous icy paths toward the spot Leo had marked as the cache. The final resting place of the evidence was cleverly disguised, a natural fissure in the rock almost invisible from a distance, where Leo had placed a shock-proof hard drive, secured against moisture and impact. Duke carefully pulled the drive out, a heavy, rugged piece of equipment painted the same high-visibility orange as Leo's strap. Sadie immediately hooked it up to her satellite laptop. The screen flashed to life, requiring only a simple password, Leo's favorite hiking trail name, which Sadie instantly knew. The moment the hard drive unlocked, they were met with an overwhelming stream of data. Geotagged photos, chemical analysis reports, and the main objective, a series of short, time-stamped video clips. Sadie clicked the first video. The footage, shot by Leo with a long-range telephoto lens, was indisputable. It showed a remote, hidden drainage pipe, clearly stamped with the logo of Apex Extraction, methodically pumping a stream of thick, toxic-looking sludge into a subterranean fissure that Leo's notes identified as the aquifer recharge zone for the local watershed. The contamination was intentional, systematic, and devastating. This was the video evidence proving Apex was dumping toxic waste into the underground water supply. They weren't just polluting the river, Duke, Sadie whispered, her voice tight with horror. They were poisoning the foundation of the whole valley. Leo was going to destroy their entire operation. Duke didn't speak. He simply stood sentinel, his ice-blue eyes scanning the ridges, confirming the threat. He had his proof. Now they had to execute the retreat. Pack it up. We take the drive, leave the collar. We're heading for the old Mine 4 access tunnel. It links up to the far side of the mountain. We can bypass their roadblocks. As Sadie expertly disconnected the hard drive, securing it inside a waterproof bag, a sound cut through the cold air. Not the wind, not a drone, but a distinct, heavy crunch of boots on the icy gravel of the quarry road below. They were compromised. Duke spun around, his hand flying to the heavy knife strapped to his boot. Stepping out from the shadow of the juniper trees, walking with cold, arrogant purpose, was Mr. Hayes. Randall Hayes, a man in his mid-50s, looked utterly out of place in the desolate mountain landscape. He was impeccably dressed in a long, custom-made black cashmere coat, over tailored trousers, a stark symbol of his wealth and disregard for the environment. His face was smooth, clean-shaven, his eyes cold and predatory, betraying no remorse. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were two large, silent men, dressed identically in dark, unidentifiable tactical gear, their faces masked by balaclavas, moving with the heavy, pragmatic lethality of hired muscle. These were Hayes's henchmen. Mr. Clay, Hayes's voice was smooth, carrying easily in the thin air, tinged with a chilling, proprietary contempt. Always the soldier, running on instinct. You really thought a cheap magnet could stop my system? You should know, Duke, my equipment is far more sophisticated than yours. He nodded toward the ground. The EMP only confirmed your exact location. We traced the energy surge. Hayes stopped 20 yards away, a distance Duke knew was too great to close before they could react. Now, hand over the orange drive. You're disrupting commerce, Mr. Clay, and that, unlike murder, is a federal offense. Sadie, quick and instinctive, pulled her service pistol from her hip holster, leveling it at Hayes. Park Ranger Sadie Matthews, you are under arrest for conspiracy and environmental crimes. Hayes barely glanced at her. His cold eyes remained fixed on Duke. Ah, the local help. How quaint. One of the henchmen silently raised a tranquilizer rifle, the small dart glinting in the sunlight. Duke grabbed Sadie's arm, his eyes frantically scanning for an escape route. The quarry road was blocked. The open rock face was exposed. The only path forward was the labyrinth of rusted machinery and dark openings leading to the abandoned mining system behind them. This was the ambush point. Duke pushed Sadie ahead, shouting, "Mine shaft, go, go!" The sound of the tranquilizer rifle's phut echoed off the red rock just as they plunged, headlong, evidence in hand, into the absolute suffocating darkness of the old, forgotten tunnel. The blackness of the abandoned mining tunnel swallowed Duke and Sadie, choking off the light and the thin mountain air. The entrance slammed shut behind them, either by design or by the concussion of the tranquilizer round hitting the rock. The cold, suffocating air reeked of iron oxide, damp earth, and decades of forgotten despair. The immediate escape into the darkness was a desperate gamble, but Duke's instincts were screaming. Behind them, they heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Mr. Hayes's henchmen entering the tunnel, their flashlights casting long, frantic beams that sliced through the gloom. The chase was on. Duke, the former ranger, instantly transitioned from civilian to combat mode. He dropped low, pulling Sadie down with him. The tunnels were a labyrinth, a perfect hunting ground for those who knew the dark. Duke did not know these specific tunnels, but he knew the rules of underground movement. Use noise to cover your own tracks. Utilize the terrain and move only when the enemy expects stillness. He found a loose, rusted piece of track iron and threw it down a side passage. The heavy clatter echoed, immediately drawing the pursuers' attention away from their true path. They moved quickly, Duke relying entirely on the small, tactical flashlight he still carried, its beam cutting a narrow path through the oppressive blackness. The confrontation was fierce but brief, centered on disorientation. When one of the henchmen blindly rounded a corner, Duke didn't use the knife. He used the environment, shoving a rusted mining cart into the man's path, the ensuing crash and curses buying them crucial seconds to melt back into the deeper, narrower shafts. It was a terrifying dance of shadows and echoes. They emerged from the labyrinthine system 20 minutes later, bursting out into the freezing, star-dusted night through a ventilation shaft on the far side of the canyon, miles from their entry point. The cold air hit them like a shock wave, but the space was an overwhelming relief after the suffocating tunnel. Sadie, her Forest Service uniform jacket torn at the sleeve, immediately dropped to her knees, pulling out her heavy satellite radio, the kind that communicated with remote stations regardless of cellular reception. Her face, streaked with dirt and fear, was nonetheless resolute. "They'll be blocking the main access roads within the hour," she gasped, her breath clouding the air. "I'm contacting dispatch. We need to upload this data before they trace our radio pulse." While Sadie worked on the complex sequence of codes needed to bypass the local emergency channels and connect directly to the regional office, Duke turned his attention to Charlie, the silver-gray German Shepherd puppy who had waited patiently by the tunnel entrance, now limped over to Duke. The dog had not made a sound in the tunnel, but his body was trembling violently. Duke knelt, checking the dog's bandage and whispering reassurances. Charlie's presence, the warm, living weight of him, was the physical anchor Duke needed. He had not retreated into his head. He had fought, protected, and focused entirely on the present. The ghosts of 1971 were silent. The memory of Leo fueled him, but the loyalty of Charlie grounded him. The journey continued upward through the treacherous network of goat trails and hunters' paths that Duke, the native son and former ranger, knew better than anyone. They had to gain altitude to ensure a clean satellite uplink. Duke, dressed in his thermal shirt and insulated overalls, led the way, his years of military training allowing him to conserve energy and move with relentless efficiency despite the treacherous ice and snow. Sadie, though exhausted, followed close behind, driven by her professional duty and the need to avenge Leo. They moved through the coldest hours of the night, driven forward by the knowledge that Hayes and his men were rapidly converging on the area. This was the ascent, a symbolic struggle from the dark depths of the mine, the place of corporate greed and murder, to the summit, the place of truth and light. As they climbed, Sadie finally established contact, her voice crackling over the staticky channel. She didn't call the local sheriff. She called the Colorado State Attorney General's Environmental Crimes Unit, confirming her role as a federal asset and the severity of the threat. She relayed their rough location, the evidence they carried, Leo's shockproof hard drive, and the identity of the pursuer, Randall Hayes, CEO of Apex Extraction. They're armed and mobile, attempting to suppress the evidence of environmental homicide. Sadie's voice was firm, though breathless. "We need extraction and immediate protective custody for the data." The response was immediate, though delayed by the weather. A specialized state patrol unit was mobilizing, but they were hours away. Duke and Sadie knew they couldn't wait. The priority was the data transmission. They reached the summit of the ridge, just as the eastern horizon began to bruise with the first pale light of dawn. It was an overwhelming spectacle. The world below them was still shrouded in shadow and cold, but above the snow-dusted peaks, were catching the first rays of the sun. Duke, his face etched with fatigue and mountain dust, carefully set up Sadie's satellite laptop and connected Leo's hard drive. The signal was strong here, high above the interference of the valley. With the sun cresting the Rockies, painting the snow and the red canyons in hues of rose and gold, Sadie initiated the upload. The small transmission light on the laptop glowed steadily, a beacon of truth against the remaining darkness. They watched, silent and exposed, as the video evidence of Apex's crimes, the footage of the toxic dumping, flowed out of the mountains and into the hands of justice. The transmission took precious minutes, minutes during which the threat felt palpably close. Just as the upload, completion chimes sounded, a sound of heavy engines drifted up from the valley below. Hayes and his men had finally pinpointed their general location. Sadie quickly packed the gear, but it was already too late for Mr. Hayes. They heard not the roaring approach of Hayes's vehicles, but the distinct, unmistakable wail of official sirens, the State Patrol and the Environmental Task Force vehicles moving in from both sides of the canyon. Sadie received a final confirmation on her radio. Perimeter secured. We have multiple arrests in progress, including the target. The evidence upload was successful. You're clear. Hayes had been apprehended trying to flee the area. His escape route, ironically, the same main highway Duke had been so worried about. The corporation had failed. Duke stood on the summit, the fierce sun warm on his face, watching the distant drama unfold below. The weight he had carried for 4 months, the guilt over Leo, the burden of his war, the silence of his isolation, finally lifted. He was vindicated. Leo's mission was complete, and his brother's memory was honored. He found acceptance not from the outside world, but from within himself, realizing he hadn't failed Leo. He had finished the fight his brother started. Charlie, the silver-gray German shepherd, limped to Duke's side, nudging his hand with his wet nose. Duke knelt, wrapping his arms around the dog, feeling the strong, loyal beat of his heart. The ghost of the mortar shell was gone, replaced by the quiet, clean whistle of the mountain wind. In the weeks that followed, the story dominated the regional news. Apex extraction was shut down, Hayes was indicted, and the massive cleanup of the Blue River headwaters began. Duke provided crucial testimony, not as a paranoid veteran, but as the meticulous, sharp analyst he truly was. He decided not to retreat to the cabin. Instead, he and Sadie, now officially working together, began establishing a private mountain search and rescue service, utilizing Duke's ranger skills and Charlie's keen instincts. The service would operate in tandem with the Forest Service, bridging the gap between official law enforcement and the rough, immediate demands of the wilderness. Duke found his healing. He sat on the sun-drenched porch of his small, rebuilt cabin, the windows now open to the mountain air. Charlie, his limp long gone, now a magnificent full-grown animal, sat faithfully by his side. Duke reached down and scratched the dog's large ears. The war was over. The messenger had delivered him not to a trap, but to a new life, finding acceptance and healing in the heart of the mountains he once tried to abandon. Duke and Charlie's journey reminds us that sometimes the most profound blessings arrive disguised as our deepest burdens. Duke sought only solitude, but Providence sent him a starving messenger with a painful truth, leading him not to death but to redemption and a second chance at purpose. It is a powerful testament to the idea that courage isn't just about surviving the biggest battles, but about showing up for the quiet battles of life, defending our communities, honoring the truth, and finding healing in unexpected companionship. For Duke, Charlie was nothing less than a miracle, a divine intervention guiding him back to the light and to his brother's justice. If you believe, as we do, that there was a higher hand guiding Charlie's paws through that Snowstorm, please share this story of faith and perseverance with someone who needs encouragement today. Let us know in the comments below what red rock you've had to climb in your own life. And if this message touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more stories where loyalty and hope prevail over the darkness. Thank you for watching. May God bless you and your family, and may He keep watch over the bonds of loyalty that heal us all.